The 92-year-old woman's purse fell from her lap as the pharmacist pointed at her and yelled for security. "She's stealing. I'm not letting some old thief walk out of here," he announced to the entire store as customers turned to stare. 2 officers arrived and cuffed her frail wrists while she sobbed and apologized, insisting she'd paid. But the pharmacist crossed his arms and smirked. In the courthouse 3 weeks later, the prosecutor opened her file, looked up at the pharmacist on the witness stand, and went completely silent. Because the first document in that folder wasn't what anyone expected. And what it revealed made the pharmacist's face drain of all color as the judge leaned forward and said 6 words that froze the entire courtroom. "Would you like to explain this?" Her name was Catherine Hayes, and she was 92 years old. Catherine had been a school teacher for 41 years. She taught 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary, the same school, the same classroom, from 1961 until she retired in 2002. She'd taught reading and arithmetic to children whose parents had been her students, and sometimes their grandparents too. She'd been the kind of teacher who remembered every name, who stayed late to tutor struggling students, who bought school supplies with her own money when families couldn't afford them. When she'd retired, the school had held an assembly in her honor. 200 former students had shown up. Some had driven from other states. Catherine had never married. She'd been engaged once to a man named Thomas, who'd been drafted to Vietnam in 1968. He'd been killed 3 months into his deployment. Catherine had never gotten over it, had never dated anyone else. She'd poured everything into her students instead, into her small apartment filled with books, into her church volunteer work. She'd lived quietly, modestly, alone. She lived now in a 1-bedroom apartment in a senior living complex on the east side of town. The building was old but clean, rent-controlled, full of people like her, elderly, alone, living on fixed incomes that barely covered the basics. Catherine's apartment was on the 3rd floor. The elevator broke down regularly, sometimes for days at a time, and when it did, Catherine had to climb the stairs, gripping the railing with both hands, stopping every few steps to catch her breath. It took her 20 minutes to climb 3 floors, but she managed. She always managed. She lived on Social Security and a small teacher's pension. $1,214 a month total. Her rent was $650. Utilities were another $120. Medicare Part B premium was another $174. That left her with $270 a month for food, medications, and everything else. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. Catherine had diabetes, high blood pressure, and osteoporosis. She took 7 different medications daily. Even with Medicare Part D, her prescriptions cost $318 a month. She couldn't afford it, so she did what millions of elderly Americans do. She rationed. She took her blood pressure medication every other day instead of every day. She split her diabetes pills in half to make them last twice as long. She skipped the calcium supplements entirely. Those were the least urgent. Her doctor had warned her repeatedly. "Mrs. Hayes, you can't do this. Your blood sugar is dangerously high. Your blood pressure is through the roof. You're going to have a stroke or a heart attack." Catherine had nodded and smiled and said she'd do better. But what choice did she have? She needed to eat. She needed to keep the lights on. The medications would have to wait. Last month, Catherine's diabetes had gotten worse. She'd started having dizzy spells, blurred vision, overwhelming fatigue. She'd known she needed to start taking her medication properly. But when she'd gone to refill her prescriptions at Save Mart Pharmacy, the closest one to her apartment, the one she'd been using for 8 years, the total had come to $318. Catherine had stood at the counter, her hands shaking, staring at the number on the register screen. She'd opened her wallet. She'd had $83. "I'm sorry," she'd said to the pharmacist, a man named Derek Hoffman, who was in his late 30s. "I don't have enough today. Can I just get 2 of them? The diabetes medication and the blood pressure?" Derek had looked at his screen. "Those 2 come to $206. Catherine had felt her chest tighten. "I only have 83. Derek's expression hadn't changed. "Then I can't fill them. Is there a generic version? Something cheaper?" "You're already on the generics." Catherine had stood there, feeling the eyes of the people in line behind her, feeling the familiar burn of shame and helplessness. "What if I pay the 83 today and bring the rest next week?" "We don't do payment plans. Full payment or we can't release the medication." "But I need it. My doctor said..." "Ma'am, I understand. But those are the rules. I can't give you medication you haven't paid for." Catherine had nodded slowly and had left with nothing. She'd walked the 4 blocks back to her apartment, climbed the 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken again, and had sat at her small kitchen table crying. That night, her blood sugar had spiked so high she'd nearly passed out. She'd been too scared to call an ambulance. The bill would be thousands of dollars she didn't have. So she'd lain in bed, terrified, praying she'd wake up in the morning. She had. Barely. The next day, Catherine had called her daughter, her only child, Rebecca, who lived 6 hours away in another state with a husband and 2 teenagers and a full-time job managing a hotel. Rebecca sent money when she could, but it was never much and never regular. Catherine hated asking, hated being a burden. But she'd called, her voice shaking, and had explained about the medications. Rebecca had been upset. "Mom, why didn't you tell me it was this bad?" "I didn't want to worry you." "I'm sending you money. Check your account tomorrow. It'll be there." "Rebecca, you don't have to..." "Mom, you're going to take your medication. End of discussion." The money had arrived the next day. $250. Catherine had cried when she'd seen it, overwhelmed by gratitude and guilt in equal measure. She'd gone to the bank, withdrawn the money in cash. She didn't trust debit cards, didn't understand how they worked, and had walked to Save Mart Pharmacy. "Before we go any further, I need to know. Where are you watching from right now and what time is it? Drop your city in the comments. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, do it now, because what happens next is exactly why we need to pay attention when the vulnerable are treated like criminals. Sometimes the system isn't broken. It's designed to punish people for being poor. Hit like if you're still with me, because this story is about to show you how one man's cruelty nearly destroyed a woman who'd spent her entire life serving others. It was a Tuesday afternoon, just after 2 o'clock. The pharmacy was busy, the line 6 people deep. Catherine had waited patiently, clutching her purse, the cash folded carefully in an envelope inside. When she'd reached the counter, Derek Hoffman had been there again. He hadn't smiled, hadn't acknowledged her. "Name?" "Catherine Hayes. I'm here to pick up my prescriptions. I have the money now." Derek had typed into his computer. "Hayes, yeah, I have 3 ready. Total is $318. I only need 2, the diabetes and the blood pressure." Derek had sighed, annoyed. He'd adjusted the order. 206. Catherine had opened her purse and had pulled out the envelope. Her hands were shaking. They always shook now, the tremor worse when she was nervous. She'd counted out the bills slowly. 10 20s, 5 10s, 6 1s, $256. She'd realized immediately she'd miscounted. She'd thought she'd grabbed $250 from the bank, but she must have taken an extra $6 from her wallet without realizing it. She looked up at Derek. "I have $256. I'm short $50. Can I bring it tomorrow?" Derek's expression had hardened. "I already told you, we don't do payment plans. But I have most of it. I just need to go to the bank. Then go to the bank and come back. The bank is 4 blocks away. It'll take me an hour to walk there and back." "That's not my problem." Catherine's voice had been quiet, almost pleading. "Please, I need this medication. I'm diabetic. My blood sugar has been dangerously high. Ma'am, I can't release medication without full payment. That's the policy." Something in Catherine's chest had cracked. She'd stood there, the cash in her trembling hands, feeling the stares of everyone in line behind her, feeling the crushing weight of her own helplessness. And then, without really thinking about it, without planning it, she'd done something she'd never done in 92 years of life. She'd taken the medication. The 2 prescription bags had been sitting on the counter between her and Derek while he'd typed something into his computer. Catherine had looked at them. Her name was on the label. These were hers. She'd paid for part of them. She'd come back for the rest. In her confused, desperate mind, it had made sense. She'd reached out, picked up the bags, put them in her purse, and had turned to leave. Derek had looked up just as she'd turned. "Hey, you didn't pay for those." Catherine had stopped, confused. "I gave you the money." "You gave me $256. The total is $206. You're $50 short." "I know. I said I'd bring it tomorrow. And I said we don't do payment plans. You can't take those." Catherine had been flustered now, her thoughts scattered. "But they're mine. My name is on them. They're not yours until you pay for them. Give them back." "I will, tomorrow, when I bring the rest of the money." Derek's voice had risen. "Ma'am, if you walk out of here with those medications without paying in full, that's theft. I'll call the police." Catherine had felt a wave of panic. "I'm not stealing. I'm going to pay." "You're stealing right now. Put them back on the counter." People were staring. Catherine's face had been burning. She'd opened her purse, fumbling for the bags, her hands shaking so badly she'd dropped one. Pills had scattered across the floor. She'd bent down to pick them up, moving slowly, painfully. Derek had come around the counter, had grabbed the other bag from her purse. "I'm calling security. Please, I didn't mean..." Derek had already picked up the phone. Catherine had been on her knees, trying to gather pills with trembling fingers, tears running down her face, whispering, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Security had arrived within minutes. 2 guards, both young men in their 20s. Derek had pointed at Catherine, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. "She's stealing. I caught her trying to walk out with unpaid medications. I want her arrested." One of the guards had helped Catherine to her feet. "Ma'am, is that true?" "I didn't mean to steal. I was going to pay. I just don't have all the money today." The guard had looked uncomfortable. "Sir, she's 90 years old. Maybe we can just..." "No." Derek had crossed his arms. "I'm pressing charges. I'm not letting some old thief walk out of here and make me look like a fool." The guards had called the police. 2 officers had arrived 15 minutes later. By then, a crowd had gathered, employees and customers all watching. The officers had approached Catherine, who was sitting on a bench near the pharmacy, her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. One officer, a woman in her 40s, had knelt down beside her. "Ma'am, what happened?" Catherine had tried to explain through tears, but her words came out jumbled and incoherent. The officer had looked at Derek. What's going on? She tried to steal $200 worth of prescription medication. I caught her putting them in her purse without paying. Did she pay anything? She gave me $256, but the total was $206. She was $50 short. When I told her she couldn't have the medication until she paid in full, she grabbed them and tried to leave. The officer had looked at Catherine. Is that accurate? Catherine had nodded miserably. I didn't mean to steal. I thought I could bring the rest tomorrow. The officer had sighed. She'd exchanged a glance with her partner, a younger man who looked equally uncomfortable. Sir, are you sure you want to press charges? She's clearly confused. She wasn't trying to... I'm pressing charges. Derek's voice had been firm. She broke the law. Age doesn't give you a free pass. The officers had had no choice. They'd arrested Catherine. They'd handcuffed her, thin metal cuffs on wrists so frail they'd barely closed properly, and had walked her through the store. Customers had stared. Some had whispered. Catherine had sobbed the entire time, apologizing over and over. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I'm so sorry. They'd taken her to the police station, processed her, taken her fingerprints and mugshot. Catherine had never been arrested in her life, had never even gotten a speeding ticket. The booking officer, a woman in her 50s, had been kind, had spoken gently to Catherine. But the process had been humiliating nonetheless. They'd held her for 4 hours before releasing her on her own recognizance. Her court date was set for 3 weeks later. Rebecca had driven 6 hours the next day, when Catherine had finally worked up the courage to call her. Rebecca had been furious. Not at her mother, but at the pharmacist, at the police, at the system that had let this happen. She'd contacted a lawyer, a public defender named Marcus Reed, who handled misdemeanor cases. Marcus had listened to the story and had immediately known something was wrong. Did you get a receipt? Marcus had asked Catherine. A receipt? When you gave the pharmacist the $256, did he give you a receipt? Catherine had thought about it. No, he was typing something on his computer, but he didn't print anything. Marcus had made notes. Okay, we're going to fight this, don't worry. The court date arrived 3 weeks later. Catherine had barely slept the night before. She'd worn her best dress, the navy blue one she wore to church, though it hung looser on her now. She'd lost weight from stress and couldn't afford to eat much. Rebecca had driven up again, had taken the day off work to be there. They'd sat in the courtroom, Catherine's hands folded in her lap, shaking. The prosecutor was a woman in her 30s, named Amanda Chen. She'd been assigned the case that morning, had barely glanced at the file. Shoplifting, elderly defendant, cut and dry. She'd called Derek Hoffman to the stand first. Derek had walked up confidently, had sworn to tell the truth, had sat down. Amanda had started with basic questions. State your name and occupation for the record. Derek Hoffman. I'm a pharmacist at Save Mart Pharmacy on Lexington Avenue. And you were working on October 17th when the defendant came into your store? Yes. Can you describe what happened? Derek had launched into his version. Catherine had come in, hadn't had enough money, had tried to take the medications anyway when he told her she couldn't have them. I saw her put them in her purse and turn to leave. I told her she couldn't take them without paying. She ignored me and kept walking. So I called security. And what was the total value of the medications she attempted to steal? $206. Amanda had nodded, making notes. And Did she resist when security arrived? No, but she kept insisting she was going to come back and pay, which is just what shoplifters say when they're caught. Amanda had thanked him and had turned to Marcus Reed. Your witness. Marcus had stood slowly. He'd been doing this job for 11 years, had seen a lot of injustice, but this case had gotten under his skin. He'd approached the witness stand, a folder in his hands. Mr. Hoffman, you said Mrs. Hayes gave you $256, correct? Yes. And the total for her medications was $206. Correct. So she actually overpaid by $50. Derek had blinked. No, she was $50 short. Marcus had paused. Mr. Hoffman, 206 is less than 256. That means she gave you $50 more than the cost of the medication. Derek's face had flushed. I misspoke. The total was $318 for all 3 prescriptions. She only wanted 2, which came to $206. But she gave me $256, so she was short by... He'd stopped, realizing he was confusing himself. Marcus had let the silence hang. So to be clear, she gave you $256 for medications that cost $206. That's $50 over the cost. Is that correct? No, Derek had faltered. She didn't have enough for the full prescription order. But she wasn't trying to buy the full prescription order. She specifically told you she only wanted 2 of the 3 medications. And for those 2, she overpaid by $50. Correct? Derek had been flustered now. Look, the point is, she tried to take the medication without completing the transaction. Without completing a transaction where she'd already given you more money than the medications cost? Amanda Chen had been watching this exchange with growing unease. She'd opened the case file on her table, had started reading more carefully. Marcus had continued. Mr. Hoffman, did you give Mrs. Hayes a receipt for the $256 she gave you? No, the transaction wasn't complete. So you took her money, but didn't give her a receipt or the medications? I didn't take her money. She offered it, but... Did you accept the money she handed you? Derek had hesitated. Technically, yes, but... So you took $256 from a 92-year-old woman, didn't give her a receipt, didn't give her the medications, and then had her arrested for trying to take medications she'd overpaid for? That's not... She didn't pay the right amount for the full... Marcus had pulled a document from his folder. Your Honor, I'd like to enter this into evidence. It's a transaction record from Save Mart Pharmacy for October 17th, obtained through discovery. It shows that at 2:17 p.m., a cash payment of $256 was received from Catherine Hayes. No refund was issued. The payment is still in the pharmacy's register. He'd handed copies to the judge and to Amanda Chen. Amanda had looked at it, her eyes widening. The judge, a man in his 60s named Harold Briggs, had read it carefully. Then he'd looked at Derek Hoffman on the witness stand. Mr. Hoffman, according to this record, you accepted Mrs. Hayes' payment. $256. Is that correct? Derek's face had gone pale. I was going to refund it after. But you didn't refund it. According to this, the money is still in your register. So Mrs. Hayes paid you $256 for medications that cost $206, which means she overpaid by $50. And then you had her arrested for taking medications she'd already paid for. Is that accurate? Derek had opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I didn't realize. Judge Briggs had leaned forward, his voice sharp. You didn't realize you'd taken her money. The transaction wasn't complete. I was going to... You took her money. You didn't give her the medications or a receipt. And then you called the police and told them she was stealing. Does that sum it up? Derek had looked at his hands. Yes, sir. The courtroom had gone silent. Amanda Chen had stood up. Your Honor, the state would like to request a brief recess to review the evidence. Denied. Miss Chen, do you have any further questions for this witness? Amanda had looked at the transaction record again, then at Derek, then at Catherine sitting at the defense table with tears streaming down her face. No, Your Honor. The state has no further questions. Judge Briggs had turned to Marcus. Mr. Reed? The defense rests, Your Honor. Judge Briggs had looked at Derek Hoffman for a long moment. Then he turned to Amanda Chen. Miss Chen, I assume the state is dropping these charges? Amanda had stood. Yes, Your Honor. The charges against Mrs. Hayes are dismissed with prejudice. Stop for a second. This is the moment. The moment where the truth comes out and everyone realizes what actually happened. Catherine spent 3 weeks thinking she was a criminal, thinking she'd stolen, thinking her life was over. Because a pharmacist took her money and then had her arrested for theft. If that doesn't make you furious, check your pulse. Drop a comment if you think Derek Hoffman should face charges himself. And share this video, because what the judge said next needs to be heard by every person in power who thinks they can abuse the vulnerable without consequences. Judge Briggs hadn't dismissed Derek yet. Mr. Hoffman, do you understand what you did? Derek had nodded, his face red. I made a mistake. You made several mistakes. You took money from an elderly woman. You didn't give her a receipt. You didn't give her the medications. And when she, understandably confused, tried to take what she'd already paid for, you had her arrested. You humiliated her in public. You put her through the criminal justice system. You traumatized her because you couldn't be bothered to keep track of a simple transaction. Your Honor, I'm not finished. Judge Briggs's voice had been cold. I've been on this bench for 19 years. I've seen a lot of cruelty. But what you did, and it was cruel, Mr. Hoffman, whether you intended it or not, is among the worst. You had power in that moment. Power over someone vulnerable, someone confused, someone who trusted you to help her stay alive. And you used that power to punish her. Derek had stared at the floor. Judge Briggs had continued. I'm referring this matter to the State Pharmacy Board for investigation. I'm also recommending that Save Mart Pharmacy review your conduct. And I want you to understand something, Mr. Hoffman. Mrs. Hayes could have died because you refused to give her the medication she'd already paid for. Her diabetes is life-threatening. You knew that. And you didn't care. He'd turned to Catherine. Mrs. Hayes, I apologize on behalf of this court for what you've been put through. This should never have happened. The charges are dismissed. You're free to go. Catherine had sat there, crying quietly, Rebecca's arm around her shoulders. Marcus had helped her stand. As they'd walked toward the exit, Judge Briggs had said one more thing. Mrs. Hayes, wait. Catherine had turned. Judge Briggs had pulled out his wallet, had taken out a $100 bill, and had handed it to the bailiff. Please give this to Mrs. Hayes. It's not much, but it might help with those prescriptions. Catherine had been too overwhelmed to speak. Rebecca had thanked him. They'd left the courtroom, Catherine leaning heavily on her daughter, exhausted and relieved, and still processing what had just happened. Outside in the hallway, a reporter had been waiting. Word of the case had leaked. Someone in the courtroom had tweeted about it. The reporter, a young man named Jason Mills from the local newspaper, had approached. "Mrs. Hayes, can I ask you a few questions?" Rebecca had started to say no, but Catherine had stopped her. "It's okay." Jason had been gentle, respectful. Catherine had told him the whole story about rationing her medications, about her daughter sending money, about trying to pick up the prescriptions and the confusion over the payment, about being arrested in front of everyone, about spending 3 weeks terrified she'd go to jail. Jason's article had run the next day. The headline: 92-year-old former teacher arrested for taking medications she'd already paid for. Pharmacist faces investigation. The story had gone viral within hours. The public backlash against Derek Hoffman and Save Mart Pharmacy had been swift and intense. Save Mart's corporate office had been flooded with angry calls and emails. Their social media accounts had been overwhelmed. People had threatened boycotts. Veterans groups, teachers' unions, and senior advocacy organizations had all issued statements condemning what had happened. Save Mart had issued a public apology within 24 hours. They'd announced that Derek Hoffman had been terminated. They'd announced a new policy. Customers who were short on payment for prescriptions could receive their medications and pay the balance within 30 days, no questions asked. They'd also established a hardship fund to help customers who couldn't afford their prescriptions. Funded with $50,000 from corporate and matched by employee donations. The State Pharmacy Board had opened an investigation into Derek's conduct. 6 months later, they'd suspended his pharmacy license for 2 years and had required him to complete remedial training in ethics and patient care before he could apply for reinstatement. But perhaps most significantly, Catherine's story had sparked a broader conversation about prescription drug costs and the impossible choices elderly Americans faced every day. A state legislator had introduced a bill requiring pharmacies to offer payment plans for prescriptions. It had passed unanimously. Several other states had followed suit. Catherine had become, reluctantly, a voice for change. She'd been invited to speak at a state Senate hearing on healthcare costs. She'd sat at the table, her hands shaking as always, and had told her story in her quiet voice. "I taught 3rd grade for 41 years. I worked hard. I saved what I could. And now, at 92, I have to choose between eating and taking the medications that keep me alive. Something is very wrong with that." The room had been silent. Several senators had wiped their eyes. The hearing had lasted 3 hours, with testimony from doctors, pharmacists, and other elderly people sharing similar stories. Catherine's testimony had been the most powerful. In the months that followed, Catherine's life had improved. The publicity around her case had connected her with organizations she hadn't known existed. Patient advocacy groups, prescription assistance, programs, charitable foundations. She'd been enrolled in multiple assistance programs that reduced her medication costs to less than $50 a month. The stress of rationing had lifted. Her health had improved. Save Mart Pharmacy had reached out through their lawyers, offering a settlement. Marcus had negotiated on Catherine's behalf. Save Mart had agreed to pay $50,000, compensation for the trauma, humiliation, and emotional distress Catherine had suffered. Catherine had been overwhelmed. She'd never had that much money at once in her life. She'd used some of it to pay off her debts. Some she'd put in savings for emergencies. And some, $20,000, she'd donated to a fund that helped other elderly people pay for prescriptions. "I don't need all of this," she'd told Rebecca. "But there are other people who do. People who are going through what I went through. Maybe this can help them." Catherine lived another 4 years. She died peacefully at 96, in her apartment, with Rebecca beside her. At her funeral, Marcus Reed had spoken about meeting her, about how her quiet dignity had inspired him to keep fighting for people the system forgot. A representative from the teachers' union had spoken about her 41 years of service, about the lives she'd touched. And Jason Mills, the reporter, had spoken about how her story had changed state law, had helped thousands of people, had proven that one voice could matter. Catherine never saw herself as an activist, Jason had said. She just wanted to take her medication and live. But when the system tried to crush her, when a man with power tried to humiliate her, she stood up. Not loudly, not angrily, just honestly. She told her truth. And the world listened. In the state capitol building, a photo of Catherine hung in the hallway outside the Health and Human Services Committee room. Beneath it, a plaque. Catherine Hayes, 1928-2024. Teacher, advocate. Reminder that the vulnerable deserve protection, not punishment, and that speaking truth to power can change the world. And in courtrooms across the state, judges reference the Hayes case when sentencing defendants in shoplifting cases, particularly elderly defendants. They'd ask prosecutors, "Is this another Catherine Hayes situation?" And prosecutors had learned to look more carefully at the circumstances, to ask more questions, to consider whether the person in front of them was a criminal or a victim of a system that had failed them. Because Catherine had proven something essential, that sometimes the people arrested aren't the ones who broke the law. Sometimes the real crime is how we treat the most vulnerable among us. And sometimes justice means having the courage to say, when all the evidence is laid out, when the truth is undeniable, this was wrong, and it's going to change. That's what Judge Briggs had done. That's what the prosecutor had done when she dropped the charges. That's what SaveMart had been forced to do. And that's what Catherine Hayes had made possible, simply by surviving long enough to tell her story. Here's my final question. Have you or someone you love ever been accused of something you didn't do, punished for trying to survive, or humiliated for being poor? Share your story in the comments. Because Catherine's case proves that when we speak up, when we refuse to accept cruelty as policy, things can change. And if this story reminded you why we need to protect the elderly and vulnerable instead of criminalizing them, hit that subscribe button and share this everywhere. Because right now, somewhere, there's another Catherine being arrested for trying to stay alive. And the only thing that stops it is people like you refusing to look away. So what are you going to do?